Professor Margaret Macmillan, welcome to New Delhi. Your doctoral thesis was on the British in India, and you've written a book on women of the Raj. What made you interested?
I'm never sure what makes me interested in something. It may have been family connections. My mother was born in India, in Bangalore, because my grandfather was in the Indian Medical Service. And so we grew up as children with stories of India. We grew up reading Kipling. So perhaps, possibly that. But I'm also very interested in communities and how they get their values and their ideas. And the British community in India seemed to me a very interesting example of people who lived in a very different culture and tried to build their own culture and what that meant and how they interacted with India. So I'm still not sure, but I'm very glad I did it.
And what did you conclude?
Well, when I first came, I came to India to do research in the National Archives in Delhi. And when I first came, I came with the attitude that the British were pretty awful, which they were in many ways, that they were arrogant towards the Indians, that they didn't want to get involved in India. And then I realized that it was possibly more complicated than that, which is what you have to do. And I realized that there were many British who did love India, who were interested in India, who learned about India, that it was more complex, that there was more nuance to my picture. And that living in India, particularly in the 19th century, a long way from home, especially for the women, I think must have been quite difficult. The Memsahibs are often seen as really horrible, intolerant people. But I began to get a sympathy for them because they lived in a world where they were expected to behave in a certain way. They were expected to be wives and mothers. They weren't expected to have jobs. And they were expected to sort of uphold the standards of the community. And so I think they were often very lonely and often put under real pressure to conform. So I hope I became a little bit more tolerant, both of the British men and the British women.
You mentioned your grandfather. I believe he was decorated for bravery.
Yeah, well, he was as a soldier. He fought in a number of campaigns. He was in the second campaign in Mesopotamia, not the first disastrous one. He was also at Gallipoli with Indian troops. And I think he was a very brave man. Unfortunately, I didn't know him well because he died when I was quite young, but my mother still has this wonderful row of medals, which we're very proud of.
You're also the great-granddaughter of one of the central characters of the war period. Did that have anything to do with your interest in the history of the war?
It's a good question. I don't know. My great-grandfather on my mother's side was David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister from 1916 to 1922, and a very interesting and rather divisive figure. And if you do modern history, as I did, you can't help but deal with him. So it may have had something to do with my interest, but where our interests come from is very difficult to tell. I mean, it comes partly from reading children's books. I mean, when I was a child, I read books that my father had from the time of the First World War about little boys going off to war and little girls being nurses, so that may have had something to do with it as well.
Why is the Great War still relevant? Why is it so much talked about?
That's such a good question, why we still think so much about the First World War. I think it's partly because of a sense that the world really changes dramatically as a result of that war. That before the First World War, the world seemed to be becoming a more peaceful place, which is not to say there weren't many wars in the 19th century, many of them outside Europe, but that there was a hope, I think, before 1914, that the world was going to become a more peaceful, prosperous, and progressive place. And after 1914, certainly for Europe, that hope, I think, was gone. And the world also looked very different after 1918. There had been a revolution in Russia, Austria-Hungary had disappeared, the Ottoman Empire had disappeared, the big European empires were beginning to move very quickly towards their dissolution. New powers such as Japan, the United States were beginning to appear on the world stage. I think also we look at the First World War and we think, without it, we might not have had the Second World War, which again has so much shaped our world. So I think for all those reasons we keep looking at it, and then there's finally the reason which I'm particularly preoccupied with, we still don't know how it started. And that's terrifying. If we don't know how we can't agree on how a war on that scale started, we are in trouble.
Is the war still very controversial?
Yes, many aspects of the war are controversial. The origins of the war are very controversial. There is literally no historical consensus. There are those who blame Germany and Austria-Hungary, those who blame Russia and France, those who say it's nothing to do with any country, it just is something that happened, the whole system broke down. Some people would blame economic forces, social forces, political forces, but there is no clear consensus. Whereas with the Second World War, we're pretty clear about how it started. There's very little argument about it. And those arguments about the First World War go on and on and on.
Which side of the debate are you on?
Well, I think I'm on the side of saying that we probably will never be able to say this is the guilty party or that factor is the guilty factor. I think in a way it's the combination of factors, and I think the particular circumstances of 1914 which really make the war break out. I mean, the best analogy I can think of is the perfect storm. A number of things come together to create a catastrophe. If they had got through the crisis of 1914, they might never have had a great war. But because of what happened in 1914, they did. And so I tend not in my own work to look for blame. I tend to try and understand. And the other thing I try and understand is what was it that made the people who had to make the decisions in 1914 and those who supported them, what was it that made them think they could have a war that would achieve anything?
Norman Stone seems to feel that it was an imperialist war.
Well, Norman Stone is a great historian with whom I disagree often. I think imperialism was a factor, clearly. Imperial rivalries had nearly caused wars before. The British and the Russians had become at odds over Central Asia. The British were very concerned that Russians were moving down towards India, which was the great game. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And the French and the British had nearly fought. The British and the Americans had nearly fought. The Germans and the British had been in tension. So yes, imperialism certainly added to the tensions, but I would argue that many of the imperial disagreements had been settled by 1914. Africa had been pretty much carved up. Asia was pretty much carved up among the empires. The British and the French had mended fences. They were now each other's new best friends. The British and the Russians had mended fences. The British and the Germans were still talking. So I think imperialism was a factor in creating tensions, but I don't think it was as live in 1914 as it had been earlier.
Do you subscribe to the theory that the war was more of a tragedy than a crime?
Oh, perhaps it was both, but it was a tragedy. I think it took a continent which had so much going for it. I mean, this is if you're European. I mean, if you were living in India or other parts of the European empires, or the British Empire, I don't think you would have seen Europe in quite such the same way. But if you lived in Europe, I mean, this was the continent that really was the center of the world. It was the most powerful part of the world. It was where you came for science and technology, where you came to borrow money. And what the war did was destroy so much of that. I mean, Europe never really recovered from the First World War. And so from a European perspective, certainly the war is a tragedy. From the perspective of those peoples around the world, in Canada, for example, my own country, or in India, Australia, Indochina, the war was bad because young men went and fought, but on the other hand, it hastened their independence.
How did naval rivalry come about?
Well, in this case, I think I would point the finger at the Germans. Britain had the world's biggest navy, and for the British this was important to protect its trade routes and to protect the routes out to and from its empire. Germany was a big land power. It didn't actually need a great navy, but in those days it was seen by many that having a big navy was a mark of being a big power. And the Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, the ruler of Germany, was very keen to have a navy, and he managed, with the help of a very skilled Minister of the Navy, Admiral von Tirpitz, managed to push through a big naval building program. And this alarmed the British, because any big German ships would come straight out into the North Sea from Germany, right towards the British coast. And the Germans said, oh, well, don't worry, you know, we don't really mean anything by it. But the British didn't believe it, quite rightly. What the Germans hoped was by building a big navy, they would not build a navy bigger than the British Navy, but they would force the British to be friends with them. Well, you know, if you pick up a great big stick and say, you're going to have to be my friend, it's not always going to work. And what the British did was just build a bigger navy and essentially won the naval race. But what the naval race did, unfortunately, was drive Britain away from Germany and closer to France and closer to Russia, which then had the effect of making Germany feel vulnerable. So it was a very, very bad part, a very bad piece of the events leading up to the First World War. I think without the naval race, Britain and Germany may well have been friends, and in many ways they were natural allies.
What about German Weltpolitik?
Well, this was the other problem, I think. I mean, ideas matter a lot in international relations, and before 1914 there was this belief, not well founded but very strongly held, that to be a great power you had to have colonies. That was not just the mark of a great power, it was what made you great. Germany didn't have colonies, or had very few, because it had come very late into the game, because it was such a new country. It only became a country in 1871. And so the Germans wanted what they called a world politic. They wanted a place in the world. They called it their place in the sun. They wanted colonies. And this led to the antagonism and the rivalry with Britain. Now, if Germany had been content to expand its huge economic power in Europe, which it was doing, I mean, Germany was more and more dominating the economies of many of the neighboring territories, it would have been much better off. But the idea was so powerful that you had to have an empire to be a great power.
That was a tragedy.
What was India's role in World War I?
Well, for the British, India was the great reservoir of manpower. I mean, in the First World War, it mattered how many people you could put into uniform, how many men, because it was almost all men in uniform in those days. How many men could you put into uniform and onto the battlefields? Numbers really counted. And the British did not have conscription. They didn't have a population that was equal, say, of Russia's. Russia was huge. And so for the British, the empire, in particular India, was the great reservoir of manpower. I mean, all those millions of Indians who could potentially, at least some of them, become soldiers.
You've argued in Peacemakers that the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Conference did not actually cause the Second World War to happen.
The Treaty of Versailles, which was the treaty that the Allies forced Germany to sign, was so vindictive and so punitive that the Germans had no option but to resent it. And that led to the rise of Hitler, and it led to the outbreak of the Second World War. My own view is that's too simple on many levels. To begin with, the treaty was not that bad. It certainly wasn't as drastic a treaty as the one that Germany imposed on Russia in March 1918, when Russia dropped out of the war at Brest-Litovsk. And if you lose a war, and that was certainly what was expected in Europe, you expected to lose territory and you expect to have to pay something. I mean, German war plans, if Germany had won, would have been to incorporate a good deal of Belgium and the Netherlands and probably parts of France, and also make them pay huge fines. And so the treaty, I think, was in itself not out of line with the other sorts of European treaties that had been signed in the past, some of them by Germany itself, or would have been signed. But the Germans were convinced that they hadn't lost the war. And if you think you haven't lost the war, they had lost the war. They had lost it on the battlefields. The armistice is a complete surrender, or pretty much a complete surrender. But the German public, encouraged by the German High Command and others in Germany, came to believe that Germany hadn't lost. So if you think you haven't lost, any treaty is not going to be seen as something that is fair. The other problem, I think, with saying that 1919 led directly to what happened in 1939 is that's 20 years. And so what was everyone doing in 20 years? They weren't just waiting for the Second World War to break out. And so I think decisions made in that period, in the 1920s and the 1930s, are very important. And I think it is quite possible to argue that without the Great Depression, Hitler would not have been invited into power. Even at that, he didn't have to be invited into power. He was invited into power by idiotic right-wing Germans who thought that they could use him. So there are a lot of ifs and buts on the road to the Second World War. I'd like to think it could have been avoided. I think if we throw up our hands and say, oh, well, every catastrophes in history are inevitable, what can we do? That doesn't help.
What about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration? These were actually made during the war.
Yes, I think a lot of agreements were made during the war in a sense of desperation. We have to try and get others in. We have to try and sort things out. And there were really three agreements or promises made in the Middle East during the war. First was the Balfour Declaration, or in no particular order, which was a promise to establish a Jewish homeland in a province of the Ottoman Empire in Palestine. And this was done very much as a propaganda gesture to get the world's Jews on the side of the Allies. The problem for the Allies had always been that Russia was an ally, and Russia was known as the leading anti-Semitic power. And Germany actually had a very good record on Jews, so that I think there was a fear that Jews around the world would tend to support the Germans and Austria-Hungary rather than support the Allies. So the Balfour Declaration was very much cast in those terms of thinking of how do we persuade the world's Jews that the Allies are really the people they want to back. The second thing that was done was that the British promised to the Sharif of Mecca, the Hashemite family, that if the Sharif and his sons led an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, against the Turks, the British would recognize Arab independence. And then the third promise, which was done in secret, was that the British and the French would divide up the territories that the Ottoman Empire lost in the Middle East among themselves. And so these promises and agreements were not compatible with each other. The Arabs thought they were getting independence. The British and the French were quietly doing a deal to try and control as much of the Middle East as possible. And at the same time, the British were promising part of what the Arabs thought was their territory for a Jewish homeland. And so that has led ever since to feelings in the Arab world, particularly of bad faith and betrayal, and a feeling that the West are always manipulating the Middle East, always against Arab independence. And those feelings, which used to be directed against the British and the French, now are directed as much against the United States, which is really the heir to the British and the French in the Middle East. What it has also led to is certainly over the years, is Arab nationalism often focusing on the Jewish presence in Palestine and then Israel as a symbol of that Western betrayal of Arab longings for independence.
Was the Russian Revolution a direct outcome of the war, or would it have happened anyway?
Difficult question whether it would have happened. My own view is not, or not in that form. I mean, Russia was a country that had huge internal tensions. I mean, it was developing very fast. Its growth rate was absolutely huge before the First World War. It was becoming a modern industrial power. It was experiencing all the strains that countries developing rapidly experience. I mean, people were moving from the countrysides into the cities were growing rapidly, there was a growing middle class, there were political discontent, social discontent, a growing union movement, and the working conditions were absolutely appalling for ordinary Russians. And so there was a growing working class movement, growing unions, numbers of strikes, but it was developing, and the Tsar had been forced to concede a constitution, and it is quite possible that given time, and without the strains of war, Russia would have gradually developed into a constitutional monarchy. Not easily, but I think there is a peaceful route that you can foresee for Russia. But the war, of course, closed that off. The regime simply couldn't cope. It didn't cope badly, actually, it must be admitted, for the first 2 to 3 years, but then things began to fall to pieces. There was a democratic revolution, but it failed to solve the problems in Russia. The chaos went on, the misery went on, and people were literally starving because of the dislocations of the war, and the war itself was deeply unpopular. That gave the opportunity for what was a tiny, fanatical fringe group, who in my view would never have got anywhere in peacetime, and that was the Bolsheviks, to seize power. I mean, they carried out a coup d'etat. Their leader, Lenin, was thinking more clearly, more directed, more ruthless than any of the other leaders around, pretty much. And so the Bolsheviks seized power, and of course they didn't relinquish it until the 1990s.
For Eric Hobsbawm, the 20th century, or the short 20th century as he called it, started in 1914 and ended in 1991. But in the light of what's happened in the Balkans and in the Middle East afterwards, would you make the 20th century longer?
Oh, I think the echoes of the war linger on. I mean, I see what Eric Hobsbawm means, because in 1991, an era came to an end. I mean, it was the end of not just the Soviet Union, but it was the end of Soviet-style communism. I mean, it's gone. I mean, there may be those around the world who hanker after it, but its force has really gone, and I think will never reappear. I mean, some other form of socialism may appear, but I don't think that particular form. And so, yes, of course, an era ends, but we still have echoes. And what happened after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, was that many of the conflicts, the old conflicts which had been frozen into place by the Cold War, were now able to come out. And so in Yugoslavia, where there had been tensions always between particularly Croats and Serbs, with the end of the Cold War, there was no longer the glue needed to keep that country together, and we saw what happened there. Same thing with Czechoslovakia. I mean, the First World War left a lot of disputes and tensions behind, which in a way were muffled by the Cold War. And what we saw in the 1990s was some older tensions coming out, fueled, of course, by very modern people who use them, like Milosevic in Serbia, who use them for their own ends.
Do you think the world has learnt anything from 1914 and 1939?
Oh, I don't know. Do we ever learn anything? I mean, the trouble is our memories are short, aren't they? You know, the first generation will learn. I mean, I think you see this very clearly in 1945, when it came to making peace. I mean, they had learned from the mistakes in 1919. I mean, the United States, for example, this time under President Roosevelt, was determined to get into the United Nations, whereas the United States had not got into the League of Nations. And in 1945, it was made clear to both Germany and Japan that they had lost. This time there was going to be no feeling on the part of those who lost that maybe we didn't really lose, maybe, you know, it wasn't fair that we had to sort of do anything. This time, defeat was made utterly clear to both the Germans and the Japanese, and there was no doubt about that. Also, after 1945, there was a really determined effort to set up international economic institutions as well as the United Nations, so that some of those old trade and other rivalries between countries, which had been so damaging in the 1930s, would be dealt with. And so I think, yes, the first generation after the Second World War certainly learnt, but we forget as time goes by. And people in Europe have forgotten why the European Union was so important as a way of bringing Europe together. And so I think we always have to relearn the important things.
Do you feel that being reminded by an older generation is not enough? That they have to re-experience something traumatic in order to learn?
Let's hope not, because I don't think the world can stand another world war. I mean, it just can't. I mean, the First World War was dreadful, and you think of the losses, the Second World War was even worse, and even more people died, including, of course, this time, huge numbers of civilians. And now we have weapons that are much worse. And I think that's something we just can't afford.
Somewhere in your book you've said that it's an inconvenient example that trade and investment between countries doesn't exactly ensure peace. And were you thinking of the European Union?
No, I was thinking actually of a sort of more general theory that a lot of liberal internationalists have, that the more countries trade together and invest in each other, the less likely they are to go to war. And my answer to that is look at Britain and Germany before 1914. They were each other's greatest trading partners. Did it stop them from doing stupid things? No, it did not. And look at the United States and China today, whose economies are very, very closely linked. Has it stopped them from being at odds with each other over things? Has it stopped both sides fearing the other? No, it has not. And so, unfortunately, for all the advantages of countries trading with each other, investing in each other, I don't think it's enough to prevent tension.
But in the case of the European Union, it seems to have succeeded.
Well, in the case of the European Union, I think it has, although if you look at some of the tensions within the European Union, you look at the British attitude towards the European Union, which has always been a very complicated one, it's tricky. But no, I like to think countries can move beyond their past. Sweden used to be the most belligerent country in the world. I mean, if you were in 18th century Europe, 17th century Europe, you didn't want the Swedes anywhere near you. I mean, they were thugs, and they came and beat everyone up. Look at Sweden today. You know, it is seen as the model of a peacekeeping internationalist nation. And I think Europe has luckily moved quite a long way beyond the poisonous nationalisms which caused so much trouble in the past, but it hasn't gone entirely.
What should we have learned from the two wars of the 20th century?
Well, I suppose if there are things to be learned, it's that you should try and understand those you're dealing with. I mean, so often as tensions rise, people begin to make assumptions about the other side, and they stop thinking rationally about them. I mean, I think it's very important to keep communicating, very important to keep understanding them. I suppose that is a lesson which could be learned. I think it's very important to have strong international institutions. I mean, unless we have places where countries can get together and talk to each other, where they can try and work out ways of cooperating, then I think we're really in trouble.
You said quite alarmingly that the situation, the global situation today, there are some similarities with that in 1914.
Well, there are always tensions in the world, and there are always tensions in countries, but I do find the present world more troubling, say, than 10 years ago. I mean, I think we have in Russia a country which seems at the moment not to want to play the international game by the international rules. It seems prepared to break the rules and not even care very much if it's caught. I mean, the Russians sent troops into Ukraine. They told a few rather unconvincing stories about these weren't really troops. They were just Russian tourists who happened to go there on holiday. And now they've admitted, Putin admitted recently, that these were in fact Russian troops. And that worries me because we rely on rules and we rely on some acceptance of international norms. And so it does worry me. What also worries me, of course, is the spread of sub-state actors, failed states. You know, the whole term failed state is a very new one. But these states cause such misery for their own people and often for their neighbors. I mean, you think of what's happening in Yemen today. You think of what's been happening in Libya. I mean, these are states which cause huge amounts of human misery and have the potential for going on, causing all sorts of troubles.
What, in your view, has the European Union done well, and what do you think it could do better?
Well, like any political entity, it can always do better. I mean, that's, you know, that's the nature of democracy. I mean, we grumble about our institutions, but then we have trouble thinking of anything that would be better. I think the European Union has been enormously successful. It has helped to build a new Europe. It has helped to build an integrated Europe. It's helped to spread prosperity. I mean, I think all of this is hugely important. It has helped to move Europe away from those dangerous national rivalries of the past which have caused so much trouble. So I think in many ways it's been very, very successful. It's encouraged the movements of people. It's encouraged young people to go and be educated in each other's countries. I think there's more to be done to build a true European identity. And I don't mean that people have to become Europeans and no longer French or British or Dutch or Belgium. People can have many identities, but I do think it's important that there should be a sense of a shared purpose, a shared set of cultural values, a shared civilization, so that people can be both European and Basque or Belgian or Flemish or Walloon or whatever. I think this is important. I think there is still a problem in Europe with a perceived democratic deficit, that people do find Brussels too far away, they don't understand European politics, and I think that is something that I think people in Europe who are working in the Union realize, and I think is very, very important to try and deal with. I think the Eurozone is a problem. I think it was probably formed, my own view, but I'm not an economist, I think it was probably formed too soon without the full sort of economic union that was necessary. I mean, in a federal state such as my own state of Canada, I think we accept that some parts are richer than others and that we have to in some ways equalize that. I'm not sure that has yet been accepted in Europe. The resentment that German taxpayers feel towards the poorer parts of Europe seem to me that there hasn't yet been this true federal understanding of what Europe could be.
So my last question is about India. In the short view, India seems to disappoint many well-wishers who feel that it punches below its weight. But somehow, if you take the long view, India has done not so badly. What's your view?
Well, I've always thought that there is an unfair and unrealistic comparison made between India and China, particularly by those who perhaps are looking from outside, and maybe people from within as well. I mean, China is seen as enormously efficient and getting things done, and India is seen as rather chaotic and complicated politics and all sorts of regional tensions and divisions. But it seems to me that India is, in the long run, more resilient than China, that it has ways in which people can express themselves, it has a free press, it has a democratic politics, it has safety valves, which in China don't seem to me to exist. I sometimes suspect that for all its successes, China is perhaps more brittle than it appears. I mean, you have a ruling party which tolerates very little dissent, and you have a ruling elite who I think are in some ways very effective. But in the longer run, will China show the resilience that India has shown? I'm not sure. I'm not sure at all. I mean, I think India may muddle through more effectively in the long run.
One of those enormous questions.
It is a huge question.
On that note, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, Margaret Macmillan. Thank you very much.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you.
Thank you.